So, December 7th, 1941. We all know the date, right? A shocking attack on a naval base in Hawaii. It triggers this massive global crisis. But what's really fascinating is how, half a world away, the fallout from that day sparked a desperate battle for survival and a fierce historical debate that's still raging. And it all kicks off with this central paradox. So here it is, the central paradox of that infamous day. I mean, the attack was a complete surprise, right? And yet, the danger was known. This quote from a congressional investigation just says it all. Officers knew an air attack was possible. They knew war was just around the corner, but they were still caught completely off guard. How does that happen? So right away, that paradox brings up two massive questions we're going to dive into. First up, how did this massive intelligence failure even happen? And second, how did that same event create this incredible crisis down in Australia, where its leader was seen as a savior by some, but a fraud by others? Okay, so let's tackle that first question. We've got to go back to those final, frantic days of 1941 and look at what the intelligence guys were seeing. Was it really a total surprise, or were the signs there all along? Okay, look at this timeline. The sheer scale and coordination of what Japan pulled off on December 7th is just staggering. You know, we always focus on Pearl Harbor, but it wasn't just that. At the same time, Japan launched attacks across Southeast Asia. The speed was absolutely breathtaking, and it caught the Allies completely flat-footed. Everywhere. And this is where we get to the real heart of the matter. See, the wild thing is, the problem for the US wasn't a lack of information. They had it. They were reading Japan's secret diplomatic codes, for crying out loud. The failure was in the analysis. They just couldn't connect the dots. And on the flip side, Japan's security was just flawless. I mean, the fleet steaming towards Hawaii, total radio silence. They were using flags and lights to talk to each other. They were basically a ghost fleet, utterly invisible. Okay, so now let's pivot. Let's see how the ripples from Pearl Harbor spread out and hit a nation that suddenly felt very, very alone. Because for Australia, this wasn't some distant news story. It was the sound of their absolute worst nightmare coming true. So to really get why Australia was in such a panic, you have to know about something called the Singapore strategy. For decades, this was it, the absolute bedrock of their national security. The plan was simple, right? If Japan ever got aggressive, the big, powerful British Royal Navy would sail down to its massive fortress in Singapore and save the day. That was the deal. Australia had basically outsourced its entire defense to the British Empire. And this image really shows you why that strategy was so deeply baked into their thinking. I mean, the whole Anzac legend, born in World War I at Gallipoli, it forged this powerful identity where fighting for the British Empire was just part of what it meant to be Australian. So yeah, their entire military tradition, all their defense plans, everything was pointed straight at London. Okay, but just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, that entire worldview, that century-old security blanket, was about to be ripped to shreds in one of the most stunning defeats of the entire war. February 15th, 1942, the unthinkable happens. Singapore, the so-called impregnable fortress, the absolute linchpin of Australia's defense, falls. It surrenders to the Japanese. And just like that, 15,000 Australian soldiers are now prisoners of war, just gone. And Australia's Prime Minister at the time, John Curtin, he nailed the feeling of national trauma with this quote. He called it Australia's Dunkirk. And that's exactly what it was. This wasn't just losing a battle. This was a moment of profound, soul-crushing crisis. Their whole strategy had just collapsed, and now the fight for national survival was on. So this is the big takeaway, the huge turning point. The Singapore disaster forces this massive, historic, and kind of painful pivot. I mean, Britain was fighting for its own life back in Europe, so Curtin makes this incredibly dramatic declaration. He basically says, okay, we're done looking to Great Britain. Australia must now look to America. And he added that it should be free of any pangs as to our traditional links. A huge moment. So the British shield is gone. It's shattered. The Japanese are advancing south, and they're not stopping. Prime Minister Curtin is now facing this absolutely monumental task. How do you mobilize a terrified nation for what he started calling the battle for Australia? And if you really want to get a sense of the sheer terror and the pressure of that moment, the historian Graham Friedenberg gives this one simple, chilling piece of advice. He just says, look at the map. That's it. Because when you do, you see it. The buffer is gone. The enemy is coming, and there's nothing in the way. And boy, did that map come to life fast. In February, just days after Singapore fell, bombs are raining down on the city of Darwin up north. Then you've got Japanese midget submarines literally slipping into Sydney Harbor. And all the while, Australian troops are fighting this brutal, desperate, bloody battle in the jungles of New Guinea to stop the Japanese from getting any closer. The war wasn't some idea anymore. It was right there on their doorstep. Now, here's a really interesting, kind of subtle point about how Curtin framed this whole thing. He very specifically called it the battle for Australia, not the battle of Australia. Think about it. The Battle of Britain was fought over British soil to stop an invasion, but Curtin's framing was different. His battle was about keeping Australia in the fight, preventing it from being cut off and knocked out of the war, and making sure it could be this vital base for the Allies to eventually strike back from. Okay, so Curtin's words clearly rallied the nation. He's gone down in history as one of Australia's greatest ever leaders. But in recent years, a whole new debate has opened up. Was he the savior who united his country in its darkest hour? Or was he a clever politician who used the crisis for his own political gain? So here's one side of the argument, coming from historian Peter Stanley. His take is that the Curtin government basically exaggerated the threat of a full-scale invasion on purpose. He says Curtin banged the invasion drum to stir up fear, tighten his grip on power, and that the result was that it completely skewed how Australians understood what was really happening in 1942. But Curtin's defenders, people like his biographer, Graham Friedenberg, they fire right back. They say that argument completely misses the point. They argue Curtin's real goal wasn't just to stop an invasion. It was to mobilize every single person and resource for an all-out war. It was about convincing a whole country that this was a fight worth every ounce of their energy, their work, and their money. And you have to remember the political reality here. It's absolutely crucial. Curtin wasn't some all-powerful dictator. He was leading a razor-thin minority government, literally holding on to power by just 2 independent votes. On top of that, he had to unite his own Labour Party, which had this long, powerful tradition of being anti-war. I mean, the guy was walking the finest of political tightropes. So where does that leave us? Was Curtin's powerful rhetoric a necessary tool to rally a fractured nation for the fight of its life? Or was it a cynical political ploy? This whole debate really leaves us with a much bigger question, one that's just as relevant today as it was back then. In a moment of crisis, when you don't have all the facts, what is the true measure of a leader? And how do we judge the choices they make when the pressure is on?